The subcommittee will come to order after recognizing myself and my friend, the ranking member Deutsch, for 5 minutes each for our opening statements. I then will recognize other members seeking recognition as well. We will then hear from our witnesses, and without objection, the witnesses' prepared statements will be made a part of the record, and members may have 5 days to insert statements and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. The chair now recognizes herself for 5 minutes. Nearly 7 years after Gaddafi's removal, Libya remains mired in civil conflict, political division, lawlessness, and economic crisis, with few signs of abating anytime soon. ISIS and Al-Qaeda, though seriously degraded, are regrouping, and as we've seen in a series of car bombings this year, they are still very much capable of violence. Despite backing by the United Nations and its partners, the Western-based Government of National Accord, or GNA, has not been able to provide security or consolidate power throughout Libya's vast territory, and it continues to clash with Eastern-based House of Representatives backed by General Haftar and his Libyan National Army, or LNA. Armed militias, some with ties to the LNA and GNA, profit off the lack of security and the rule of law, smuggling drugs, smuggling weapons and people. And migrants using Libya as a waypoint into Europe suffer horrific treatment at the hands of smugglers, including torture, sexual abuse, and enslavement. Adding to the chaos, a host of external actors continue to back different Libyan factions, with the U.S. and the UN supporting the GNA. Egypt, the UAE, and Russia supporting Haftar, and Qatar and Turkey supporting the country's Islamist groups. And as we saw when 3 French soldiers were killed fighting ISIS alongside Haftar forces in 2016, even France has played both sides, sometimes assisting the U.S. and the GNA, while at other times supporting Haftar and his factions. All of this has made political reconciliation more remote, as both sides have dug in their heels and negotiations have stalled. The prospect of UN-backed elections this year, which were probably too soon anyway, also seems to have fallen by the wayside. There are some encouraging signs, however, including better governance at the local and municipal levels and growth in the oil sector, which for now has saved Libya's economy from collapse. And it remains to be seen how Haftar, now confirmed hospitalization in Paris, will impact Libya's fractured state. If he is indeed incapacitated, will this be the opening that Libya needs for reconciliation, or will there be more chaos as his coalition breaks apart and his backers look for a successor? With the challenges I've laid out, as well as the competing foreign policy priorities elsewhere, it is perhaps understandable that this administration would be wary of spending political capital in Libya. The administration does so at its peril, however, as this is a problem that is not going away and is only going to get worse for the region, for Europe, for U.S. interests if it is not addressed. Just last month, our U.S. commander in Africa stated that, quote, "The instability in Libya and North Africa may be the most significant threat to the U.S. and allies' interest on the continent," end quote. Our partners in Tunisia and Egypt are already feeling the impact. Mali, Chad, and Sudan have been impacted, and we've seen how ISIS networks in Libya can reach into Europe with the Manchester and Berlin terror attacks in the last 2 years alone. Libya's instability is a major problem for U.S. interests, and we need a concerted effort from this administration to make it a priority. It's past time to appoint a new U.S. ambassador to Libya. And soon as it's viable from a security standpoint, we need to consider reopening our embassy in Tripoli to increase engagement on the ground. The administration should also fill the empty special envoy slot as soon as possible so that the U.S. has another dedicated diplomat who can work with our partners and coordinate our Libya policy, whatever that may be. More than anything, more than military aid, more than financial aid, Libya needs U.S. leadership. Leadership that can corral the various countries interfering in Libya, leverage our connections, and help push the political reconciliation process forward. I urge this administration to give Libya the attention that it deserves. And with that, I'm pleased to yield to my friend, Mr. Deutsch, the ranking member.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, for calling this hearing and for your continued recognition of Libya's importance. I also would like to thank our panel of witnesses for attending and for their wealth of knowledge on these vital topics. We've all been shaken and horrified by the images and stories coming out of Libya, including slave markets, dismal conditions of refugee camps, extrajudicial killings, torture and illegal detention facilities, and other human rights violations on a shocking scale. These are all issues that desperately need to be tackled and are all symptoms of the years without a functional government. This committee is proud, I am proud that this committee unanimously passed House Resolution 644, strongly condemning the slave auctions of migrants and refugees in Libya. But we acknowledge the only way to stop such evil practices is to see Libya set toward a path of lasting stability. Despite the efforts of the United Nations, the internationally brokered government of national accord based in Tripoli has been far from successful. The rise of competing strongmen and militias, defined by their quickly changing loyalties, and the persistent vacuums allowing terror groups to grow are preventing the country from moving towards stability. And these factors of instability are enabling a humanitarian crisis to fester and worsen, emphasizing the need to address the root causes of Libya's plight. Unfortunately, the country's trajectory does not appear to have been altered over the previous year in any way that would suggest that conditions are improving. Attempts to bring together warring parties have been hindered by fractured loyalties and varying goals. Libya's economy is disjointed and struggling to rise above the prevailing black market. This only serves to promote smuggling, trafficking, and other illicit activities. Libyans who once benefited from the country's oil reserves lack opportunity and job prospects, with youth unemployment now over 40%. Unfortunately, without functioning institutions, the government will continue to lack the ability to put basic structures in place for economic improvement. A continued fractured government and persistent security concerns will also prevent investment in the country. The implications of Libya's unrest and instability don't only apply to its own security. Libya's neighbors are directly impacted by the lawlessness, movement of smuggled weapons, and trafficked people, and a draw for terrorist groups seeking safe haven from regions with stronger rule of law. As we've seen in Syria, Russia is attempting to expand its influence by exploiting the Libyan unrest. With little regard for human dignity and international law, Russia will not lead Libya toward stability. They will only work toward furthering their own interests, likely at odds with our own national security priorities. That is why a coherent United States policy, along with the U.S.'s work with the UN to move Libya in the right direction, becomes even more pressing. The U.S. has long focused on counterterrorism pressure in Libya to combat the various extremist threats plaguing the country. This is continuously challenged by the difficulty in securing Libya's vast desert borders. Border security is further challenged given the chaos in the Sahel and sub-Saharan Africa, the use of Libya as a transit point for ISIS and Al-Qaeda's allied fighters, and smuggling of weapons to various terror groups. As conflict persists among Libya's armed forces and militia groups, it appears less and less likely that border security will increase. We maintain the goal of setting Libya on a course towards stability through a buildup of democratic institutions, the resiliency of which is not reliant upon personalities, but upon the framework of a functional government. U.S. engagement has been a challenge given that U.S. embassy personnel continue to operate out of Tunis, but nonetheless, we remain committed to democracy and governance and civil society programs. Of course, a solution for Libya must be, ultimately, a Libyan solution. We must look at the specific population needs, cultural dynamics, tribal identities, and social conditions to find a path forward that works for Libyans. And despite the obvious challenges, it remains in our national security interest and those of international stability that we continue to encourage and assist Libya in moving toward stability and preventing dangerous transnational terror groups from finding safe haven there. Only once good, honest, and comprehensive governance takes hold will the root cause of the horrors that we've witnessed be truly addressed. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses as to how Libya can best move forward on a path of reconciliation that resists the influence of non-state actors and provides stability and opportunity for all of the people of Libya. And I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deutsch, our ranking member. And now I'd like to turn to the members of our subcommittee for any opening statements they'd like to make. And we'll start with Mr. DeSantis of Florida. Mr. Kinzinger of Illinois.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't have a lot to say except that obviously we find ourselves in a pretty tough situation there. A lot of debate, a lot of questions, but I think it's obvious that with the part of the world that Libya is in and potentially the ramifications for the rest of the world, including Europe, of a failed Libyan state, it's important that we stay engaged. And unfortunately, we've been seeing Libya sometimes how we've been seeing, for instance, Syria, which is just through the lens of a counter-ISIS campaign, which is important. But this is a much bigger issue than just a fight against terror. So I appreciate all of you being here, and I want to thank the chair for having this hearing, and I'll yield back.
Thank you very much, Adam. Mr. Shabbat of Ohio.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for holding this important hearing, and I'll be very brief. Having been I happen to be the chair of this committee when Gaddafi fell, when the Arab Spring, so-called Arab Spring, was happening, et cetera, and I was. You
might have been the cause of all
maybe,
this democracy
maybe
movement.
all this democracy, but I was in Libya with the ambassador a month before he and 3 other brave Americans were killed, and so it was obviously a traumatic experience for our country. It's one of the, I think, most unfortunate circumstances, not that incident necessarily, but just the overall chaos that ensued after the fall and where we are now. There is a tremendous amount that needs to be done in Libya, and hopefully this hearing will shed some light on that. And so I thank you very much for holding it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was such a tragedy. Thank you so much, Mr. Shabbat. Mr. Cicilline of Rhode Island is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and the ranking member for holding this hearing. Libya has been a difficult challenge for the United States and our allies since the fall of Muammar Gaddafi. As we've seen in many other places, it's far easier to topple a government than to rebuild a new one. Libya continues to be challenged by political fragmentation, rival factions, decentralization, terrorist threats, and the challenges of migration. I want to take a moment in my opening to recognize and remember the men who were killed in the attack on our consulate in Libya in 2002. Ambassador Chris Stevens, Sean Smith, Glenn Doherty, and Tyrone Woods served our country with honor and gave their lives in defense of our freedoms. I thank our witnesses for appearing here today and look forward to hearing your perspectives on what we can do to help stabilize Libya and ensure a viable path forward so that the people of Libya can live in peace. Thank you, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you so much, Mr. Cicilline. Seeing no other requests for time, I'm so pleased to recognize our witnesses. First, we're delighted to welcome Mr. Christopher Blanchard, a specialist in Middle Eastern affairs at the Congressional Research Service. Mr. Blanchard has covered developments in Libya since 2005 and served as an election observer for Libya's first post-Gaddafi elections in 2012. Very historic. Thank you for being here today. We appreciate all the work you've done over the years at CRS, and we look forward to your testimony, Mr. Blanchard. Next, we're delighted to welcome Dr. Frederick Wary. Did I do that right? Thank you. Senior Fellow in the Middle East Program at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and a 21-year veteran of the U.S. Air Force. Thank you for your service, Dr. Wary. He has just had a book published about Libya, has written many articles on Libya and the wider Middle East. Thank you for your service again, and thank you for your testimony today, Doctor. And finally, we're delighted to welcome Ms. Alice Friend. Is that right? Just like that? Okay, Friend. That's a great name. Senior Fellow in the International Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Previously, Ms. Friend served in various roles at the Department of Defense, including as Principal Director for African Affairs in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. She has also held numerous research positions at CSIS and at the Center for New American Security. Thank you for being here today, and we also look forward to your testimony. As I had said previously, your written testimony will be made a part of the record. Please feel free to summarize. We'll start with you, Mr. Blanchard.
Thank you, Chairman Ros-Lehtinen, Ranking Member Deutsch, members of the committee, for inviting me to testify today on behalf of the Congressional Research Service on Libya. I'll summarize my testimony by briefly making 3 observations. First, as you've discussed, several internal and external factors are disrupting Libya's post-Gaddafi transition. These factors are interrelated, and they've been very difficult to overcome. For example, transitional leaders and institutions with competing claims to legitimacy have accumulated in Libya since 2011. This challenges U.S. preferences to work with and through a single national government partner. Since December 2015, the UN Security Council and the United States have recognized the negotiated GNA as Libya's governing authority. This seeks to confer international legitimacy on the GNA and to encourage unification. But nevertheless, the GNA and its eastern Libya-based rivals have made little progress, as you've noted. The GNA's reach remains limited, and importantly, it relies on militias for security support. In 2017, UN officials launched an action plan to move the transition promptly and to renew the legitimacy of these Libyan institutions, but its implementation has stalled. Meanwhile, the power of armed non-state groups remains unmatched, and there's a lawless atmosphere that persists. Militias, criminals, and terrorists, including remnants of the Islamic State, operate with impunity in some areas, endangering civilians and committing human rights abuses. These entities exploit instability and state weakness for political and financial gain. This creates powerful incentives for them to maintain the unstable status quo. Thousands of migrants, refugees, and internally displaced persons remain particularly vulnerable. Many foreign governments are seeking to mitigate transnational threats emanating from Libya, and some are actively working to shape the transition's outcome in line with their preferences. Libya's oil resources, its geographic location, weak institutions all raise the stake of its instability for others. Libyan-based terrorists, traffickers, and armed groups pose risks to U.S. partners in North Africa, the Sahel, Europe, and beyond. Locally organized Libyan actors cooperate and compete amongst themselves and with these outsiders. Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, and the European states are all engaging directly with different Libyan factions for a range of specific purposes. As my written testimony and reporting for CRS describe in more detail, this produces a complex and opaque web of overlapping interests and rivalries. Taken together, these challenges and dynamics are likely to last and to have enduring effects, even if the current mediation efforts improve. Second, U.S. policy in Libya has 2 main goals. It seeks to eliminate Libya-based terrorists, combat other transnational threats, and it seeks to support the transition to a unified, inclusive, and accountable government as the basis for long-term stability. The Trump and Obama administrations have used different blends of diplomacy, military operations, sanctions, and foreign aid to achieve relatively consistent objectives over time. Diplomatically, the United States is lending support to UN mediation rather than seeking to engineer a U.S.-defined solution. Given that zero-sum attitudes have divided post-Gaddafi Libya, U.S. policymakers judge that an inclusive, Libyan-defined solution is more likely to result in stability than solutions imposed by force or by outsiders. Current policy also reflects a judgment that a settlement can't be reached without international support and coordination. So, what more can the United States do to support Libya's transition? Events since 2011 suggest a series of factors to consider. More active U.S. diplomacy and more robust assistance could boost actors that share U.S. goals, but also could create enduring costs for the United States, link the United States to actors that lack domestic legitimacy, or invite others to intervene similarly. Less active U.S. involvement could reduce diplomatic and financial burdens on the United States, but could simplify relations with outsiders, but it might also result in less desirable security outcomes. If security were to deteriorate rapidly, containment costs could increase, pressure on U.S. partners could rise, and calls for new U.S. intervention could emerge. Third, for Congress, different scenarios may raise unique questions, but certain topics have been shown to have lasting relevance in Libya regardless of how conditions have evolved. These include the balance of U.S. diplomatic, military, and foreign aid efforts, the roles of other outside actors, frameworks defined by the UN Security Council, funding and terms for U.S. assistance, the selection and vetting of U.S. partners, and authorizations for the use of military force. This concludes my brief remarks. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Dr. Wary.
Thank you. Thank you. Chairman Ros-Lehtinen, Ranking Member Deutsch, members of the subcommittee, it's a privilege to speak with you here today about Libya's ongoing struggle for stability, peace, and unity. I join you having visited Western Libya in December of last year, where I glimpsed firsthand the severity of the challenges, the growing power of its predatory armed groups and criminal networks, the plunder of its economy, the potential reemergence of radicalism, to name but a few. Underpinning all of these afflictions is the weakness of governing institutions and national political fissures. I'll start with my visit to the central coastal city of Sirte, the object of intense American focus in 2016 during the war against the Islamic State. While the Islamic State was ousted from its stronghold there at the cost of over 700 Libyan lives, Sirte faces daunting challenges of reconstruction and recovery. Bridging the social damage brought by the Islamic State's divisive rule is especially crucial, as is restoring law and order. Though the Islamic State has dispersed to the desert southwest of the city, it is still potent. It could easily exploit Libya's political divisions and the unwillingness of armed groups to confront it. We've seen this before, where Libya's opposing factions were so focused on battling each other that they ignored the growing radical presence in their midst. That's why national level reconciliation is so important, along with unifying and reforming the security sector. Another important component of reform lies in the judicial and penal sector. Arbitrary detentions, torture, and killings in militia-run prisons is a potential time bomb for radicalism. In one such prison that I visited, suspected Islamic State fighters are detained in the same facility as petty criminals and drug addicts, along with the political rivals of the militias. And of course, the militia-run detention centers for migrants are a wholly different moral tragedy. Thousands of migrants are kept in these horrific conditions, which I saw firsthand, and many of these detention centers, of course, are run by militias affiliated with the government of national accord. All this must change. Though security conditions and the absence of a diplomatic presence have constrained our ability to engage, there are still plentiful opportunities, especially at the level of municipal governance. Elected city councils in Libya are one of the country's bright spots. In many cases, they enjoy strong legitimacy, and they've been engines for reconciliation in a way that national actors have not. American aid and assistance to municipalities is therefore a worthy investment. But municipal governance is hampered by corruption in national economic institutions. Libya is afflicted by a culture of entitlement by its armed groups, many of whom, as I've mentioned, are affiliated with the government. The plunder of Libya's central bank adds to the income that these groups already get from illicit activities like smuggling, fuel smuggling, and human trafficking. A lasting fix to this problem requires sustained American diplomatic engagement with officials from the central bank and other economic institutions. Now, all of these challenges I've outlined hinge upon progress on the political front, on national reconciliation. The U.S. and its partners must continue to play a strong convening and persuading role, especially among its regional Arab allies and also the Europeans, to support the UN-led roadmap. The UN-led roadmap is currently headed toward convening national presidential and parliamentary elections. This shows that Libyans have not given up on democracy despite the turmoil of the past year. However, a word of caution is in order. Elections by themselves, if they're held hastily without a constitutional framework, risk a return to strife. We've seen this before in the past in 2012 and in 2014. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you here today.
Thank you so much, Doctor. Ms. Friend.
Chairman Ros-Lehtinen, Ranking Member Deutsch, members of the committee, distinguished colleagues, it is my pleasure to be here today to discuss the current situation in Libya. The complexity of the civil war in Libya is rivaled only by the complexity of the related crises it breeds. The diversity and ferocity of the country's domestic politics create obstacles for terrorists attempting to establish havens, but also make the role of Islam in governance a central and contentious object of Libyan politics, amplifying Libya's salience to global Islamist terrorism. Libya's oil resources, proximity to Europe, and cultural connections to the Middle East make it a strategic prize for multiple powerful outside actors, and its competing governments and myriad militias fuel an international race for Libyan proxies. In the midst of it all, an historic volume of migrants is coming through Libya, fleeing into the Mediterranean and overwhelming European and broader international resources. Ending major violence and stabilizing Libyan politics to the point where powerful actors accept a single government will be the most durable way to address terrorism and humanitarian needs. Yet the path to political equilibrium will likely be a long one. The international community, including the United States, should have a patient and realistic approach to Libyan politics that also accounts for Libyan internal security concerns. The current challenge for the U.S. is knowing whom and how to engage among the constantly shifting array of power brokers and would-be national leaders to encourage political accommodations and meaningfully address the humanitarian crisis. The reported incapacitation of the Libyan National Army commander and the East's dominant center of power, Khalifa Haftar, is likely to generate some political and security realignments if Haftar is unable to return to the country. Although group alignments with the UN-backed government of national accord should open the door to outsider engagement in principle, the persistent dynamism of Libyan politics recommends a cautious approach to security assistance. Even if the policy remains largely focused on countering ISIS and al-Qaeda, the U.S. will need to determine ways to sustain pressure on terrorist groups without undermining the prospects for Libya's stability. With regard to ongoing U.S. efforts to disrupt and dismantle ISIS's operations in Libya, I believe the current offshore pressure campaign and counterterrorism capacity building efforts among Libya's neighbors strikes the right balance between U.S. national security and the prospects for Libyan stability. Given the range of crises consuming American policymakers' time, it seems likely that U.S. efforts in Libya overall will remain relatively modest. But continued negotiations and implementation of the Libyan political agreement are best accomplished with the support of the U.S., not only in a diplomatic sense and by eventually assisting the development of national security forces, but also in a role supporting UN Security Council prohibitions on disrupting constructive intra-Libyan balances of power. This latter effort requires deft diplomacy, especially with Gulf partners and Russia, given the issue linkages elsewhere. But it would be the kind of international leadership only the U.S. can provide. Thank you again for calling us together today, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you very much. Excellent testimony. We are very grateful for it. I wanted to follow up on something that I had said in my opening statement about Haftar and his health. We've discussed the power struggles between the West and the East, the GNA and the LNA, and how external actors back different factions. With the uncertainty around Haftar, this raises serious questions about the direction in which Libya may go if he is incapacitated. And we may have already seen the first bit of fallout this very afternoon as news reports indicate that the general's chief of staff survived a car bomb today in Benghazi. So if you could tell us what the implications could be for the political process and for Libya's security if the general is out of the picture, and of course we don't know that, or perceived to be weakened. And of course, Haftar's health scare and the uncertainty that it brings also calls into question the UN envoys in Libya's efforts and assertion just last month that he believes Libya is still on track to have elections before the year is out. I think that was more aspirational than realistic, but it does raise questions about the UN support mission in Libya and the special representative's role in all of this, and it also underscores the lack of a role of the United States has thus far played in Libya. Can the UN effort be successful without the United States leadership in Libya? And how could the U.S. use our leverage to bring the external actors together to support the UN effort to seek political reconciliation? And as you know, last month, the Foreign Affairs Committee passed House Resolution 644, strongly condemning the slave auctions, Mr. Deutsch talked about it, of migrants and refugees in Libya. This is obviously a major concern and a reprehensible human rights issue, but I was hoping we could get a better understanding of the trafficking picture and the actors involved. Who is responsible for detaining migrants and refugees in Libya? Are there outside actors involved? How do they come in? How do they operate? What role do the Libyan factions play in all of this? And how can Congress and U.S. do more to help this awful situation? You can tackle one or all of them as you see fit, whichever one is your favorite, Mr. Blanchard.
That's a rich agenda. I'll try to proceed through those quickly. I think the danger in the East is a vacuum, both political and military. As we've seen, we're observing or you're hearing more about what's behind Haftar, right? The LNA is a coalition, and so from a security standpoint, that's quite true. The different forces would need to select new leadership, and that could get messy. With regard to politics, Haftar's personal ambitions, not directly and often clearly stated, are a sticking point in the negotiations. His desire, at a minimum, to lead security forces, if not play a political role in the future, has been a sticking point. His removal could arguably create an opportunity in that regard. In terms of the role of the UN mission and the United States, I think it's helpful to think about the role that the U.S. plays with the UN as setting a floor. Our role in the Security Council, our vote and diplomacy there with regard to things like the arms embargo, things like assets, is the quiet backstop to what the UN mission is trying to do. In addition, our diplomacy, the statements that have been made in the Security Council are quite clear that this is the plan, this is the way we're moving forward. So while we are not taking an active role, if you ask the actors with whom we may have challenging relationships, they certainly see our role as present. So.
Thank you. That's comforting. Thank you. Dr. Wary.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I think Haftar's removal in the East would just underscore what we've always known, that his coalition, was just a coalition ever since he launched his operation in May or the summer of 2014. Tribes, different religious groups, different militias attached themselves to his operation for their own self-serving purposes. Once he could claim liberation of Benghazi, that coalition has started to unravel. So even before his health problems, there were also a lot of dissent when I was there in Benghazi against his style of rule, against the empowerment of his sons, against his political ambitions, his corruption. So all this was building. You have different centers of power in the East, 3 different cities. You have different tribes that are maneuvering. The bottom line is I think you're going to see jockeying. It may devolve into some violence. I think it's also an opportunity in the sense that if some new figure emerges at the head of the LNA, the Libyan National Army, that could be more amenable to Western Libya, that could be an opportunity for reconciliation. It's important to underscore in Western Libya just how demonized Haftar was because of his baggage, because of his political ambitions. I think the United States has an important role to play with the regional Arab states that backed Haftar, the United Arab Emirates and Egypt. They had already been cooling about General Haftar a bit. He was not delivering for them. I think this just underscores the point that if these regional states want influence in the new Libya, they need to, support the backing of a new figure in the East that is more amenable to reconciliation and unifying the country.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wary. Ms. Friend.
Ma'am, I agree with what my colleagues have said. I think there will be a real fight for control of the LNA if he doesn't return. I think who takes over will really matter because if it's a contentious figure, then the infighting will continue, and if it's a powerful
Let me just
figure,
interrupt. And when you say fight for control, will that be a bloody fight for control, an electoral fight for control?
I think it'll be bloody, ma'am. I think, as you pointed out in your comments, we're already perhaps starting to see some of the struggles in today's car bomb attack. And so I think there will be several consequences to this that are possible. There could be reduced pressure on violent Islamist groups in the area. Governance of Benghazi will certainly be very different going forward. I think it will interrupt reconciliation between the East and the West simply because it's unclear who Westerners now negotiate with. But it may help continuance of the LPA, which Haftar had announced in December was now defunct. So I also agree it might be an opportunity. I also think it's going to interrupt Russian influence, at least for a time. They're going to have to figure out where they're going to put their investments now. On the U.S. side, I tend to focus on the counterterrorism piece, and I think it's important that the U.S. continue to be extremely discriminating in targeting, because again, as all of these groups are realigning on the ground, we need to know exactly who we're watching and who the enemies are and who is simply caught up in the fight, as it were. And when it comes to trafficking, I would just say there's great variance among groups across the Sahel and how much they benefit from and are involved in trafficking, but it does allow them to blend in, if you will, and they're part of a larger illicit criminal networking lawlessness problem. And so, again, from a targeting perspective and figuring out who it is that we are most interested in from an American national security perspective, that just complicates matters.
Very difficult to figure that out. Thank you so much. And I'm pleased to yield to Mr. Cicilline.
Chairman, thank you to our witnesses. The UN-appointed envoy to Libya, Ghassan Salami, plans to amend the 2015 political agreement establishing the current government, hold a national conference, call a referendum on the Constitution, and hold elections this year. As I'm sure that you are all aware, and Dr. Guerre, you mentioned this, Human Rights Watch warned last month that Libya is not ready to hold free and fair elections, citing concerns about potential coercion, discrimination, and intimidation. So I'd like to know from each of you, what milestones does Libya need to reach to demonstrate that it is ready actually for fair elections? And I suppose, what can the U.S. do to help create the conditions for them to achieve those milestones?
So to begin, the Libyan electoral authorities have conducted a new voter registration drive, and that's one of the sort of highlights that Special SRSG Salame points to. You know, 2.5 million Libyans stepped forward to participate. That shows a baseline of desire to participate in an election. The laws surrounding a referendum, the setting of districts, the balance, all that needs to be agreed and hasn't been. Again, as the special representative points out, I think he said at the meeting in Saudi Arabia, some of our Libyan brothers are very creative in their means of preventing action on those electoral issues, the nuts and bolts, right, the electoral law. That needs to be taking place, so I'd watch that quite carefully. We saw participation decline over the past electoral exercises, and so to the extent that that we see turnout, it's something to watch very closely, because really what this is about is the legitimacy, the lack of legitimacy in domestic institutions. That's what needs to be reset here.
Thank you.
I think there are a number of, key danger points. The first one is the lack of a constitutional framework. My discussions with Libyans is, without a constitution, whatever government's produced is going to be yet another transitional government that's going to lack legitimacy, lack real authority. The other key milestones are voting laws, security. My visits to especially Eastern Libya underscored a degree of disenchantment with democracy that, we tried these elections before. Some people want a strong man, and that's why Khalifa Haftar was able to step into the void. And so people saw that after the 2012 and especially the 2014 voting, there were parliaments that could not deliver to their constituents, that were locked in petty disputes, and that led to strife. So overcoming that popular aversion, to elections is important.
Thank you. Anything to add?
Yes, sir. I would say that I think a study of the conditions prior to the 2014 elections would be very useful, because, of course, those elections were what then led to greater disillusion politically inside the country. And then just from my own narrow purview, I always say capacity for electoral security is extremely important, because elections marred by violence, as we've seen in Kenya and elsewhere, have very poor outcomes as well.
Thank you. Some have argued that, based on the highly fractured nature of Libyan politics, governance may be better suited for a federalized system, granting relative autonomy for various regions. And I'm wondering whether you believe some manner of federalized Libya might bring about increased security and popular confidence in governance. compared to a strong centralized government where they've had so much, I think, disappointment with that model. Is that a feasible thing to consider, or do you think that's...
Decentralization has been a core theme of the political conversation in Libya since 2011. As Fred mentioned, municipalities have stepped forward into the void to a certain extent. While a federal arrangement or a decentralized political arrangement may emerge, difficult questions about state resources, the distribution of funding, management of security, all those would remain to be decided and dealt with, and it's likely that those will remain difficult.
If I could just, one final question with the chairman's indulgence. We've heard a lot about outside actors in Libya, and I want to focus for a moment on Russia, which appears to be playing several sides in this conflict. There are claims that Russia has facilitated the delivery of weapons to Haftar's forces, sometimes through legal sales to Egypt. The Russian special forces are reported to be operating in the porous border region between Egypt and Libya. So I'd like to know a little bit, if you could give me your assessment of what is Russia's goal with respect to Libya, what does it have to gain in Libya, and what does the U.S. risk by Russia increasing its influence or attempting to increase its influence in the various warring Libyan groups long term?
I think Russia wants to undercut European and U.S. influence. I think this is an opportunity for them. I think they have a number of financial goals in mind regarding arms contracts, that many of which they had before the revolution, gas deals, they had infrastructure projects. So I think partly it's monetary, but it's also a political opportunity. I don't think they've got all their eggs in the Haftar basket. I think they're diversifying their contacts to include Misrata, to include Tripoli. They see themselves as a potential power broker that could certainly undercut the U.S. and the Europeans.
Yes, sir, I'd agree with that. I think they're playing as many sides as possible so that they'll have influence in the eventual government that wins out.
It's also like to raise, I mentioned the Security Council earlier. The Russians have the same quiet role that we have, an ability to delay and obstruct.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Cicilline. Excellent questions and great answers. And now I'm pleased to yield to one of our favorite veterans on our subcommittee.
Oh, thanks.
Mr. Kinzinger.
Thank you. That's very nice. Thank you, Madam Chair. And as I said in the opening, thank you all for being here. I actually think Libya is an interesting study. With all the challenges we have, it actually could end up, if we figure out how to handle it, it's a very wealthy country with a relatively small population. And I also use Libya as kind of the example when people argued, although I think the situation on the ground's changed a little bit much now, against intervention in Syria. I said, well, you have 500,000 dead Syrians. You don't have that level of instability in Libya, even though there's a major challenge. The problem with Libya is our failure to follow through, I think, after what was rightfully an intervention, and then we just kind of assumed it would all work itself out, and it didn't. So I think, leaving Libya with no strategy for dealing with a post-Gaddafi world, we can look back 2020 and say, here's everything. I think it is important for us to talk about, though, what we could have done differently post-Libya, because it would be naive of us to think we'll never be in this kind of situation again. So, Mr. Blanchard, if you have ideas of what we could have done differently, or else we'll go down the panel, I'm curious what you guys would say. If you could go back in time, what would you have changed in order to try to create a better post-Gaddafi scenario?
I think perhaps Alice might be better suited to talk about the Obama administration's view and what the conversation may have been. The president himself has been clear in terms of what he saw as the failure, and it really was his presumption, as you mentioned, the assumption that it not just that it would work itself out, but that the European partners and Arab states would step forward in a coordinated manner. If we look at the diplomatic level, it really is what SRSG Salome calls too many cooks in the kitchen, and too many cooks maybe with bad intent or their own selfish intent. So it's that coordinating function, the speaking with one voice, and making sure that there wasn't daylight such that those individual interests could begin to play themselves out and amplify the internal dilemma. So early coordinated action may have been something that I would focus on.
Ms. Verenda, actually, if you want to jump into that, and then we'll go to you, sir.
Yes, sir. By the time I stepped into my Pentagon job in the Africa office, from a DoD perspective, we were already quite cautious because the empowerment of militias, of course, was off and running, and so it was very hard to know from a security assistance perspective which party not only was aligned with the legitimate government we recognized at the time, but also would continue to be aligned and would continue to be a good faith actor. Which was something that AFRICOM certainly emphasized as well.
Did you guys discuss peacekeepers at all, and was that even a possibility?
I don't recall us discussing peacekeepers at that point. I know that it has been in the ether, especially among some Europeans, for quite a long time. Peacekeeping itself has its own sort of difficult track record as well. Peacekeeping is an extraordinarily difficult thing to do, and it really depends on the parties on the ground wanting to have a peace to keep. And I don't think we were there with Libya yet. And so I think the complexity and difficulty of the environment was something that we simply did not recognize long enough into it. And by the time we did, it was very hard to be able to have meaningful influence on the ground, particularly given the security situation for our own personnel. So I do wish, if I could rewind the clock, I wish that the U.S. had perhaps taken a more forceful role at the United Nations, that we'd been more involved among the parties, although I know Ambassador Stevens could not have been a better person to be there and working that issue. So it is possible that Libya is a case where forces on the ground were such that it would have been very, very hard for the United States to do anything unilaterally, but I do think the international community could have put in much more focus and effort in the early days between 2011 and 2012 to perhaps head off the worst of the violence and get the negotiations started sooner.
Thank you, sir.
I think in the first year there was an excessive focus on elections as a success marker, and so the UN was entirely focused on elections to the detriment of dealing with the DDR problem, with the militias, with the security sector. I think the U.S. handed this off to the Europeans and the United Nations, who were both unable and unwilling to address it. So you had these elections, but then you had no way to protect democratic institutions from the power of militias. That raises the question of a stabilization force, which I agree brings a whole host of other consequences, but perhaps even a limited stabilization force to secure key facilities in Tripoli, the parliament, economic institutions, to protect them from militia pressure. The huge challenge of demobilizing the militias was made worse when the Libyan government itself started paying the militias with oil wealth in late 2011. That was a disastrous decision. So perhaps more U.S. oversight of Libyans' use of its oil wealth could have stopped this disaster. I think by the time we got around to trying to train and equip a Libyan military force, the general purpose force, it was too late. That effort led to disaster because the militias were too strong. So again, the bottom line is I think we missed a key window in that first year to exert more of a presence.
And I think it's somewhat to the extent of the mistake made in Iraq, where we went in and there was a sense of lawlessness after the invasion instead of law, and people turned. And Madam Chair, if I could ask just one more question with
Absolutely, go ahead.
leniency. When we talk about Haftar, and can you guys, for whoever has the knowledge on it, maybe all three of you, how would you compare him and how you would see a Libya under the rule of Haftar, if you will, versus like Gaddafi? Is he more benevolent? Is he as ruthless? What's kind of the sense there? And I'm sure there's no way to really know, but what's your thoughts?
Muammar al-Gaddafi was a very unique individual, so I'd be reticent to compare or expect anyone would behave quite that way. The fact of the matter is that, personality aside, Libya has changed. The political and security power has been atomized. And any individual and or ruling arrangement that emerges from this process is going to have to recognize that. In an odd sense, the Libya of Gaddafi's imagination with individual communities leading themselves and feeding up to it, that's ironically now more the case than it was when he was there. And so whoever is leading Libya in the future is going to have to deal with, as I said, this atomization that's occurred.
Fair point.
I think his Haftar's support, well, was already weakened, so he didn't have the sort of total control that Gaddafi had. But that said, there were a number of similarities that his opponents have drawn and that I witnessed when I was in Benghazi. I mean, he was cultivating his sons. He did sort of enact a cult of personality where you would go around Benghazi and see billboards of Haftar's picture everywhere. The police state, people were not free to speak their minds in Benghazi. People who criticized them disappeared. Censorship of the press. He brought back the old secret police. He relies on tribes. He tries to manage tribes, play them off against each other. So there are some, similarities. That said, as we've seen with his failing health and his diminishing influence, I don't think it compares to Gaddafi. So.
Excellent. And did you have anything else? Okay. Well, thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Connolly of Virginia.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and welcome to our panel. Dr. Warrior, let me start with you. You said one of the bright spots potentially, not to overstate it, but we're kind of at the local level in terms of elections, function, and that was music to my ears. I come from local government. I think it is long neglected. I think a lot of our democracy promotion programs start at the top. So we start with the parliament, as opposed to start at the village level and work your way up. Can we build on that, do you think? And could that maybe affect our strategy moving forward in maybe a different course for us in terms of what we pursue in Libya, and given the fact there is a hopeful sign, but it's working at the local level?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've seen a number of positive developments where there's been reconciliation between towns that were previously fighting. Towns enjoy strong legitimacy with their elected councils. This was true, in 2012 through the president. Although I will caveat this, that in the East there are non-elected mayors that have been appointed by the Army. So American engagement through USAID, through other channels, is absolutely the right way to go. However, not necessarily these non-elected councils. But I think, helping them to deliver services. The problem, though, it goes back to the national level where they don't get their budgets. I mean, they're criticizing the government of national accord for the way it distributes its budget. So I think American engagement has to be from both levels. I mean, the local is important, but it can only get you so far. There has to be engagement at the national level.
Yes, but the thing about local government that all over the world gets, some institutions just don't get it about. But if you want to build democracy, it's built on a social contract.
Absolutely.
I pay my taxes and you pick up my trash. I pay my taxes, the clinic is open when I need it. I pay my taxes, the road gets paved. I pay my taxes, there's a clean source of water. If, on the other hand, there's no respect for that and there's no culture of, well, what do you mean? We're supposed to make all that work. We don't do that. It's corrupt, not our business. Well, then you are going to completely erode confidence in the basic institution of governance and why it exists, let alone democracy, what kind of government. And I think often that gets overlooked, and that's why I picked up on what you said as one maybe hopeful sign that we could build upon, expand. God forbid we invest in it. Mr. Blanchard, we've met before. We had a talk about terrorism in the Maghreb, and one of the things I recall you and I talking about, and I want to give you an opportunity maybe to talk about it on the record here, but Libya is kind of key. I mean, if we're gonna get at terrorist instability in parts of Tunisia, parts of Algeria, parts of Morocco, you cannot ignore the big, huge festering sore of Libya. It's kind of key to addressing all the other potential hotspots in the region. Could you elaborate a little bit on that and how what we're talking about relates to other things we also care about in the region?
Sure. As I said earlier, I think the United States is one actor among many outside Libya that's seeking to mitigate transnational threats, terrorism in particular. I think terrorism is the key driver of Egypt's desire to back quote-unquote strongman approach to security in eastern Libya. I think the continued availability of weapons, the ability, particularly on the southern and southwest borders, of people to transit back and forth allows a place for the ISIS fighters that Fred talked about being displaced from CERT to hide, regroup, to reorganize. I also think that in terms of our investment, the Department of Defense is, to the extent that we are investing in a sort of long-range counterterrorism approach, it's a containment strategy, and it's built entirely on this. So it's a draw on our resources as well. With regard to local communities, I did just want to observe the USAID program, the Transition Initiatives Program, has a lot of components that are focused precisely on aspects that you raised, helping local communities and local government improve services, take the temperature of the town and see what they need. So that kind of grassroots approach is one component of our policy, but as Fred observed, in the absence of a nationwide, national political accord, it's going to be difficult for those to really prosper.
Yeah, it's harder, but I'm a big supporter of both NDI and IRI and think they're necessary. But I think sometimes it's easier to work with parliamentarians in the national capital than it is to roll up your sleeves and go down to the village level and try to help them do their jobs and do it in a way that incorporates accountability and transparency, which are elements of democratic institution building. That was my own, from my own personal experience of working on some projects before I had this job. Sometimes we do it well, sometimes we don't. And I believe the building block of democracy starts at the local level, not the other way around. Can I just ask one last question? This is the big philosophical one, but I was in Libya a few years ago with our former colleague David Dreyer under the House Democracy Project. And what struck me about Libya was, unlike some other places, you essentially have 3 population centers. They're all near the coast. You don't have a huge interior, population. It's relative to some other places, not all that heterogeneous. It's a pretty homogeneous population. Tribal divisions, yes, but they're used to, they're just coming off, one-man rule for quite a long time. You could call that stability, not one we desire, but it's not like it's a novel thought that there could be a government, a central government that exercises authority. It's a small population. So why is this so hard? Why has it already been so long that we see this kind of chaos, this inability to put together meaningful coalitions that can govern and into which the population can invest and support? Why is it so hard?
Congressman, thank you. I agree. These were all things that led to our optimism after the 2011 revolution. I think the fundamental problem is Gaddafi, ruined this country. He gutted it of institutions. So the Libyans had no experience in self-governance. The entire muscle fiber you need to run a country was missing. Gaddafi ruled this in a highly personalized, way. So things like civil society, unions, elected municipal councils, they were all starting from scratch. And the fundamental vacuum is also the security sector. There was no army, so you had the growth of these militias. You had, unfortunately, during the revolution and after, you did have, real divisions growing between these different towns that acted like autonomous statelets that coalesced with their own militias, their own sources of income. I agree. It is a small population. It should be easier. The final thing I'll add is the management of the economy. This is as the UN has mentioned, at its core, this is a contest for plunder, for access to economic resources. So the economy is both, I think, a blessing and a curse.
Sir, can I just say, historically speaking, the idea of Libya as one unified country is actually an anomaly. It's a very regional organization, and in fact, there still is no rail line between Eastern and Western, and it's very hard to drive. There's just not a lot of even infrastructure integration between East and West, and the Fezzan in the South has always been isolated. And so I think, at least from a regional perspective, even though it is a small population, there actually isn't a tradition of integration across regions in Libya. And so to some extent, this is a project that's imposing a new concept on Libya, Gaddafi notwithstanding. I mean, I think he papered over a lot of things and just did it through strength of arms. And so I think, and I was intrigued by what Mr. Blanchard said about how, the hangover from Gaddafi is such that there's now a deep suspicion of centralized authority. So it's not a historical tradition, and with Gaddafi as their example, why should the average person in Benghazi or Derna trust the Tripoli government? And this is what folks there have to overcome.
Thank you.
I wouldn't want to let the international community off the hook. As I said, seeking to mitigate transitional threats or pursuing their own agendas, political, regional, ideological, has led to a lot of interference, and it's amplified the real internal challenges and difficult dilemmas, zero-sum behavior, security threats that Libyans are facing. When you have outsiders coming in, observing a difficult situation and saying, well, I need to back this person to solve my problem, that has an amplifying effect. And it's really, I think, helped account for what we've seen since 2011.
Madam Chairman, you've been so gracious, but it's been a very thoughtful
Thank you very
conversation.
much.
Thank you.
I pay my taxes and I want clean water. I pay my tax. I got it. Thank you so much, Mr. Connolly. I would like to ask, if you would allow me, the questions that Mr. Deutsch had, and they've kind of been covered a little bit, but I want to make sure that his are covered extensively. First, the UN Refugee Agency estimates that there are 1.1 million people in Libya in need of humanitarian assistance. Displaced families, refugees, and those living without basic services or health care continue to demonstrate Libya's need for assistance. So Mr. Deutsch asks, do you think the U.S. is providing adequate levels of humanitarian assistance to Libya? And what gaps remain where the U.S. or our international partners could step up? Mr. Blanchard.
Sorry, I'm looking for the data points that I brought with me because I want to get this right. So there is an international humanitarian response plan for Libya. The United States is the top contributor from 2016 and 2017 of humanitarian funding by just a hair. The Germans and the Italians, the Europeans also put forward funds to support that. The needs that have been identified, I think, were 70% met last year. Could more be done, particularly with regard to some of the migrant situation? The United States approach has been, I think, to let European states and the European Union take the lead there. Working together, the European Union, African Union, and the UN have taken some steps to address that problem. Again, the United States, I think, declaratory policy is quite supportive of that, and behind the scenes, we are making contributions.
Chairman, I defer to Mr. Blanchard on the actual specifics, but let me just underscore that the refugee displacement issue is so profound, and I saw it firsthand. I mean, hundreds of families displaced from the city of Benghazi are crowded into other cities in the west, Misrata and Tripoli. There are refugees from the south that are in the capital. So these refugees are straining the ability of the government in the capital. You have other local communities that have been displaced through fighting. The city of Tawarga is the main example, and I've been in their camps, and there are truly horrific conditions. Young kids growing up year after year in these squalid refugee camps. So it's a huge, I think, moral problem. The U.S., I think, can always be doing more. I think its role, however, should be focused on Libyan economic institutions that can better address the plight of those displaced economically. So there again, that leads me back to U.S. engagement with the central bank.
Thank you. Ms. Friend?
Madam Chairman, Ranking Member Deutsch mentioned root causes, and I think in this case it's important to distinguish between the humanitarian needs from the Libyan population as a result of the violence and then the humanitarian needs of the migrant population coming from sub-Saharan Africa largely. And when it comes to humanitarian needs for the Libyans, to address that, of course, involves addressing the root causes of the violence. And so that, again, gets us back to these reconciliation efforts. And when it comes to the sub-Saharan Africans, then that is also its own set of root humanitarian and governance issues that are driving people out of their homes. So we think about Eritreans crossing the desert in Sudan to get to Libya, to get across the Mediterranean. Addressing what's happening in Eritrea or what's happening in Niger or Mali, I think, is as important as catching the problem by the time it gets to Libya.
Thank you very much. And his second question, thank you for those answers. The U.S. and the UN continue striving to work through the existing framework established under the Libyan political agreement to establish and move Libya forward. Some, however, do not recognize this agreement's legitimacy. In your opinion, do you believe this framework is viable, or does a new path need to be forged?
I think the SRSG's current approach is driven by, as I said in my opening statement, a desire to refresh the legitimacy of institutions, and in particular so that decisions can be taken by a recognized authority. So in terms of a legitimacy deficit, it's clear, not necessarily that we in the United States get to decide that or point to it. It's Libyans themselves think that various institutions lack legitimacy. And so this entire exercise is arguably aimed at that.
I agree. I mean, I think this was an important starting point. It was flawed. Certainly it was opposed, but it was at least a mark on the wall. And so before you peer into the abyss and jump into you have to have something to replace it. I think the UN's approach with amendments, with reviving it, giving it new legitimacy is the right approach. Of course, there are multiple actors across the board that benefit from the status quo and spoiling it. Some of these actors are backed by international states, and that's why I think the U.S. has an important convening role to get everyone on the same page, to say let's move forward on this roadmap. This LPA certainly was flawed, but it was signed up to, and it needs to be the basis.
Ma'am, I address in my written testimony the security elements of the LPA, which I think in principle are very good. And the problem with the implementation has been making the leap, as I say, from militias to a national military force. And in particular for the HOR in Tobruk that works with Haftar, the issue has been command and control and the Presidential Council being the commander-in-chief of the armed forces with which elements of the HOR are not comfortable. So I think in these discussions, if these issues can be worked out, the framework of the LPA from a security perspective is quite sound.
Well, we alternate between, high hopes, low expectations, and it's just some kind of wild ride. Unfortunately, so many lives are at stake. Thank you so much for excellent testimony, and please tell Mr. Deutsch that I did comply with his questions. I did my homework. And with that, the subcommittee is adjourned. Excellent witnesses. Thank you.
Glad you had that data. It's like we're making
No carbons.
yeah. Good to see you.
The book coming out. I mean, I know it's out.
It's out. Yeah, I need to get you a
my
copy.
signed copy.
Come to the.
Thanks very much. No, I will get my copy, but I need you to sign it.
Yeah, come to the opening, the launch. When? 24th.
Where?
Yeah.
At the center?
Carnegie. Yeah,
Carnegie, very nice.
Yeah, it's been a while. So
24th, Bulldog Days at Yale. My third son is going out. No, that means I'm gonna.